was sort of an avalanche of difficulties here. But if you had young children who had to be in school, you had to stay in Houston or Atlanta or Little Rock or San Antonio or Ogden, Utah, or wherever the bus had dropped you. When we went to Kobe, Japan, we had this opportunity about a year after the hurricane. Kobe had had a terrible earthquake. It took them 13 years to get back the population. We found that hopeful because at least they could recover after 13 years. The Japanese government did exactly the opposite of what the federal government in the United States did in Katrina. They immediately allocated $4.5 billion within 6 weeks of Kobe and put the first expenditures into rebuilding senior housing and low-income housing to try to retain those populations. In New Orleans, we're in a situation where the housing projects are only partially rebuilt now, almost 8 years after the storm. So those families aren't coming back, can't come back. They weren't able to come back in Kobe either, as it turned out, when we were actually there for the most part. Because once relocated, the farther distance you are from where you were, the harder it is to come home. So one of the things we have to learn, and in talking to many people, Joe and Laura and others around the Springfield area, the same thing. Nobody makes sure that you can get housing as close as you could to where your existing neighborhood was. But if you're going to try to rebuild your home, it helps to have a place to live where you can sleep at night and go work on your house during the day, the weekends, or whatever. And this was constantly the problem. Well, in New Orleans, is that people were coming from all over the Gulf South back on Friday night and leaving again on Monday morning to try to repair their houses. So first it starts with education, with jobs and housing, then health and education. But there also just turn out to be huge deficits if you don't have organizational capacity. One advantage, we go through at some length in the book, and I've now noticed in a number of other disasters it's true too, is one ironic advantage for ACORN turned out to be that we were a membership organization, which meant that there was no mediating influence between us and our membership in trying to locate people. Institution-based organizations, organizations of organizations, organizations that work through religious institutions. Once those institutions were also displaced, those organizations didn't have the access or capacity to be able to react to the disaster and help people. As a membership organization, we could find people through text messages and through, not email so much at that time, and a number of other things. But it allowed people to be able to also use the organization and its capacity as essentially a rallying point. So one of the first things people would do is get signs for their yard that said no bulldozing. And for any of you who paid attention in the Katrina period, you could see even when the second President Bush came to celebrate supposedly the first anniversary of Katrina, was having his picture taken in front of Fats Domino's, legendary, iconic rhythm and blues singer down in the lower 9th Ward, and you could see 3 signs on Fats's fence that said, ACORN, no bulldozing, ACORN, ACORN, and the phone number. But that was part of what it meant, is that being able to react quickly and do a house gutting program that could establish that there was less than 50% damage to your house, the quicker that was done, the more quickly you could, in fact, rebuild where you were, as opposed to having to tear down the house and elevate it, depending on what the new FEMA flood maps might say, 5, 10, 12 feet high above where your existing property was. All these things were only possible if you had organizational capacity to be able to react. And what we found over and over again, things that we had to do which made all the difference in the world. Getting forbearance from banks on all lending for almost a year so that nobody was having to pay mortgages for houses that might have been flooded was not available in Springfield, no matter. We had the conversations, and many organizations or individuals that were interested. Nobody had the capacity and wherewithal to either move politically or institutionally with the banks to get that forbearance. Stopping foreclosures, which we were able to do for the first 2 years after Katrina. Stopping enforcement by the sheriff's office of any eviction notices, same period. Trying to get people back in their houses on commitments from landlords on previous tenants. All these things are, there are a million moving pieces after a storm that has this kind of impact, and having some organizational capacity to be able to react to that turns out to be something that makes a huge amount of difference. ACORN was always, you know, certainly for the 38 years I was there, and it turns out even for the several years it lived after I left, was always a controversial organization. And it was one of those organizations where from 1970 in Little Rock, Arkansas, when it was founded on, people would often say, well, I kind of agree with ACORN, but I don't like how they do it. Or there'd be, you know, I think, yes, low-income people should have some power, but I don't like their tactics. It was interesting in Katrina, the attitude of the public changed around 360 degrees, or whatever is the distance from, you know, one place to another, on how they viewed ACORN, because ACORN so clearly was able to get on the ground and move effectively within its neighborhoods in a time when no one else was. And in some ways, I think that in the worst of the times that ACORN ever had, the New Orleans community where we had our headquarters and where the fight for the Ninth Ward and other areas was so intense, was really a game changer in terms of the organization's perspective. ACORN was not a it is a nonprofit, but was not a tax-exempt organization. So although this was often confused by Brother Glenn Beck and you know, the U.S. Congress and so many others, it was never a 501c3 tax-exempt organization. So there were never any boundaries about its ability to get involved in politics. If the members raised their hands and wanted to do something about a politician, thank them, or, you know, pick at his yard or whatever, there was never a point where an organizer of ACORN would have to get up and say, oh no, you really, I know this is a democratic organization, but you really can't do that because this is the tax status of ACORN. It was always, as long as there was a vote, that could be done. And the huge difference in the rebuilding in New Orleans had to do with the mayor and council having to be elected. Similar to Springfield, there are districts and several at-large seats in the New Orleans City Council. So it's a strong mayor government. So there's a very similar alignment to what's existing in Springfield. The difference is everybody was coming up to an election. First they postponed the election at the storm. It was supposed to happen several weeks after that, and it was postponed until later in the spring, almost 7 or 8 months later. But, you know, New Orleans residents, even in the diaspora, not able to come back, still had the right to vote. So huge, you know, leverage came to the organization if it could identify people in the diaspora that were not available in any other way. So the fact that we had lists, knew where our members were, knew who the members were, could actually, when candidates for mayor or city council wanted to go to Houston, Dallas, Little Rock, you know, Shreveport, any of these, Atlanta, we could actually organize meetings of ACORN members in those cities for them to be able to talk to who were from New Orleans. So it wasn't just having a local organization. This is not a story of small is beautiful. There's nothing about community organizing that ends up with the story that small is beautiful, polish the pearl. This is a lesson I have for you. In fact, you really do need to be able to put together an organization at as many levels as possible to operate with power. And the fact that ACORN had the advantage of having a network of membership and staff and offices in the catchment areas for the Katrina diaspora was able to be converted in a very powerful way to leverage on the political figures that was independent of the planning process, where the planning process was business and elites, similar to what the Springfield plan seemed to read like, who essentially wanted some areas of the city not to be rebuilt. They argued that the lower Ninth Ward, for example, should go back to swamps and cypress trees, even though the average, and this is obviously covered in the book at length, but the elevation in the lower Ninth Ward is actually on the average about a half foot above sea level. I know that doesn't seem like much up here in the foothills of the Berkshires, but in New Orleans, where in some areas like Lakeview, which came back very quickly, an upper middle income area near the lake, the average was 5 to 7 feet below sea level. So Lakeview and the lower Ninth Ward are interesting comparisons. The percentage of home ownership in the lower Ninth Ward was actually higher than Lakeview. The problem in the lower Ninth Ward is